Morning. My own conflict of interest is not financial, it is intellectual indeed, as I'm an activist researcher. I track, or try to, because we are far from numerous enough, to track the political influence over EU policies of corporations. My main field of expertise, though, is the European Food Safety Agency. I've been invited here, for which I'm very grateful. But so my observations will be, as far as the EMA is concerned, a bit general and a bit transversal as well. But I hope there are enough similarities for this discussion to still be useful. Next slide, please. I have not done the 2 required slides. I apologize for that, but there's much more in my slides than what I'm going to do, so I will summarize what's in there. First of all, I think the workshop title reflects a bit of a wrong framing of the debate, as it seems to be that independence or expertise would be somehow something that you have to choose between. I think it's absolutely the opposite. Independence is actually part of the expertise you need as when working for a public health agency. This is actually well reflected in the regulation itself. And I would like to quote a bit in full this excellent quote by David Michaels, which is now the head of the Occupational and Safety Health Agency in the US. Conflicts of interest can be managed is the current mantra. Well-meaning administrators of these committees believe they desperately need the leading researchers in their fields, regardless of how conflicted they may be. In some areas of medicine, it is difficult to find experts completely unaffiliated with the drug companies. This has been mentioned already. A common response from scientists with financial conflicts is that their judgment is not influenced by their employment relationships. This we've heard also. To give them the benefit of the doubt, most of these scientists honestly believe this, and their honesty is not at stake. This will be my next slide. But evidence strongly suggests otherwise. This is known as the thunder effect in political science. Financial ties cloud judgment. If we cannot predict which scientist will be influenced, and all evidence is that we cannot, we need to limit the use of all conflicted scientists. I'm convinced that conflict of interest cannot be managed, it must be eliminated. Too much is at stake. We've talked a lot about medicines development lately. Let's remember that what we are doing in those agencies is risk assessment. It's a very different thing. A PPP, for instance, is very useful for technological development. It is deadly for risk assessment. Next slide, please. So an important observation is that a policy on independence is not about chasing morally dubious individuals. This is not the picture, and this is unfortunately the kind of public perception of a conflict of interest, is that, and this has been said by many people this morning, that somehow you will be dirty working for industry or whatever. Actually, this is absolutely not the case. Well, an independence policy is something at the institutional level to protect the political integrity of an administration. This is actually not specific to the public sector at all. This is absolutely standard in the private sector as well, in the form of non-compete clauses and employment contracts. You cannot go to the competitors of a day. That's normal rule. I switch that. Yeah, what we've heard a lot from regulators and media is that somehow they have this idea of a conflict of interest, that this would be an industry mole. This misses the point. Regulatory capture, as this is what we're talking about, is about subtle, systematic, and long-term influence strategies. There's actually a very good quote from '78. It's a bit old, but this is the moment all these strategies were created, mainly by the tobacco industry by then. This is most effectively done by identifying the leading experts in each relevant field and hiring them as consultants or advisors, or giving them research grants and the like. This activity requires a modicum of finesse. It must not be too blatant, for the experts themselves must not recognize that they have lost their objectivity and freedom of action. At a minimum, and I insist on this, a program of this kind reduces the threat that the leading experts will be available to testify or write against the interest of the regulated firms. The fact that it's more and more difficult to find independent experts is also a consequence of a long-term industry influence strategy to prevent those experts to be used against themselves, against their employers. Next slide, please. I'll skip the example. That's another very important one, about the attractivity of the agencies for scientists themselves. We've heard a lot that it was difficult for scientists to work with agencies that don't pay them and poorly recognize them. This is very true. A root problem that seems to be both in EMA and EFSA apparently, is that involvement in regulatory work is rarely considered an attractive option in a scientific area, particularly for the young ones. So this can be a consequence of a poor public reputation by this agency. It can also be explained by the fact that these experts are not paid, most of them, they're volunteers. And also what they do within these agencies cannot really be used in normal scientific circles because it cannot be published. Why? Because it's mainly based on industry dossiers that are covered by commercial confidentiality clauses, sorry, for the stuttering, which means that basically you cannot publish in a normal peer-reviewed review what you're doing. So reinforcing agencies' attractivity for scientists is absolutely paramount. And for this could involve also giving these agencies the means to self-task, or even better, but that's not for this year probably, blindly commission research to independent labs. You could imagine a system where the costs of the risk assessment are borne by the industry, but everything is not centralized. The assessment is done, the clinical trials, say, are done by independent laboratories who don't know what they're trying. You blind the results, you blind the substances. This way, you have actually a genuinely scientific system in place. Next slide, please. Yes, some of a bit of nitty-gritty details on the systems now. One of the major flaws of the existing system in place in the agencies is self-assessment. You have to work on both EMA and EFSA, for what I know, are only working with the information that's given to them by the experts themselves. This has several problematic consequences. The first is that external individuals end up bearing the responsibility of the whole institution's independence, which is unfair. Data is inconsistent and unreliable. You cannot be judge and jury, which means that you cannot have a strict and consistent enforcement of the policy, meaning media scandals will keep coming and public trust will still be endangered. The paperwork and bureaucracy involved by checking individual DOIs is huge. It's enormous, and it's probably disproportionate in view of the above. This policy is usually strongly disliked both by the officials in charge and the scientists themselves who feel under suspicion. This we've heard a lot this morning. A recommendation would be more capacity for checking conflicts of interest and to build more experience and knowledge of industry influence tactics. I was extremely impressed, not to say shocked, in my conversation with certain agencies about the degree of ignorance, actually, of the 20 years plus years of literature published in political science about regulatory capture. I mean, this is well recognized, well documented. It could be actually this is my bias. I would be very happy to have public bodies write about industry influence. That would save a lot of time for me. Next slide, please. Yeah, for what we've seen, the conflicts of interest tend to be assessed too restrictively, and the different grades and in the conflicts of interest that is currently being used by EMA seems to be very complicated and to free up a lot of room for arbitrary assessment. Can you actually measure the intensity of a conflict of interest with industry? Is an indirect conflict of interest always worse than a direct one? I'm not sure. So more clarity and consistency would be needed. I think strictly banning conflicts of interest with industry and industry-sponsored activities is paramount. Scientists with conflicts of interest whose contribution would be seen as indispensable for scarcity reasons can still be invited as expert witnesses without them having drafting and decision-making powers. I think we can find some agreements in the room for that. Next slide, please. Yes, I will skip this one because that's important. It's the distinction between financial and intellectual conflicts of interest, but we can keep that for later. Seventh, last observation. I think that the idea that only industry scientists would be competent and available for agency is unfortunately solidly established as a mainstream cliché, but it is both untrue and self-defeating. This was very well put by a French lobbyist for the pharma industry in the parliament last year. Independence is a guarantee for incompetence. John Daly, the former Health and Consumers Commissioner, said more or less the same in 2001. It is impossible to exclude industry scientists. He was speaking about EFSA. In general, this we've heard also, the competitiveness mantra and its translation into the research policy, that's 15 years of incentives to establish public-private partnerships between academia and industry, and the excessive political influence enjoyed by cooperation are endangering the reliability of the risk assessment of industry products today. As far as the relative scarcity of experts, well, this is something you hear a lot, but there was a recent health affairs paper tackling the, well, that's the US, but almost half of life science academics responding to their survey reported no relationships with industry within the past 3 years at least. So it seems to me that there's still room for maneuver. The EU still has dozens of universities and thousands of scientists that are free and from links with industry. In-house training is always an option. And my conclusion, scandals about industry influence over regulation with the public losing trust in regulators translate in real additional public health problems. You can think about the vaccine scares, for instance. It's very problematic. In Brussels today, the rate of vaccination for children is 78% only. It's below the 85% threshold, which is needed for the herd immunity. It's very troubling. And the argument you hear a lot for that is, yes, but vaccines are bad. It's harmful. There's all sort of toxic in there. And anyway, we can't trust the industry and the regulators is bought. It's excessive. There's a lot of disinformation on these issues, but if we cannot trust the EMEA to give a reliable voice on this, how can we do? Which means, in my opinion, that public health agencies relying on industry experts for the risk assessment of industry products will ultimately undermine their very raison d'etre. Thank you very much. And sorry for being a bit too long.